The world is closer to a new armed conflict than many imagine, and it could start where you least expect it, on the high seas. In the South China Sea, warships face each other like predators in an arena without rules. At any moment, a shot, a collision, or even a miscalculated maneuver could trigger a devastating war. We're talking about one of the most tense and militarized points on the planet. But why has this seemingly isolated region become the epicenter of a potentially global conflict? Why are China, the United States, Vietnam, the Philippines, and even countries you may never have heard of willing to fight or kill over a handful of islands and coral reefs? The answer involves power, oil, fishing, trade, and survival. If you think this has nothing to do with your life, get ready. Because everything you consume, from the price of gasoline to food at the supermarket, could be affected by a war in this sea. And the burning question: is the world prepared to deal with it? Or is it already too late? At the heart of the South China Sea disputes is a line drawn on maps since 1947. The famous 9-dash line. Under Chiang Kai-shek, the Republic of China, now Taiwan, claimed nearly the entire sea basin. In 1949, with the communist victory, the People's Republic of China adopted these same boundaries, reinforcing the argument that Beijing holds historic rights to islands, reefs, and waters rich in natural resources. But even before that, Chinese people had been sailing and fishing in the region since the Han Dynasty, 206 BC, 220 AD. These early records in ship's logs and imperial maps serve as the basis for the Chinese nationalist narrative, which claims continued use and traditional dominance of this maritime space. This historical version, however, clashes with documents from Portuguese and Dutch navigators from the 16th century, which point to the presence of Malay and Filipino sovereignty long before there was any effective Chinese control over the deep waters and reefs of the region. In the 19th century, the advance of European imperialism deepened tensions. France, upon colonizing Vietnam, began exploiting maritime resources such as coral and precious mollusks near the Spratly and Paracel Islands. In 1887, with the French protectorate over Vietnam formalized, Parisian warships patrolled reefs now disputed by Hanoi and Beijing. Decades later, the Japanese occupation during World War II introduced new military boundaries and islet infrastructure, creating patterns that still define strategic positions today. The Cold War transformed the South China Sea into a geopolitical chessboard. The US and the Soviet Union, targeting communist expansionism, supported Southeast Asian regimes, while China consolidated its claim through makeshift military bases. In 1982, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea (UNCLOS) established concepts such as the Exclusive Economic Zone, EEZ, up to 200 nautical miles from the coast. This legal framework seemed promising, but it opened fissures. Beijing declared that the 9-dash line overlapped with the EEZs of the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei. Each of these countries deposited its instrument of ratification of the convention, creating EEZs that directly conflict. The Philippines took the case to the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, 2013 to 2016, and obtained a favorable ruling, validating its exclusive rights over parts of the Spratlys. China, however, ignored the verdict, claiming that the tribunal has no jurisdiction over its historical claims. Today, Beijing invests billions in the construction of artificial islands, airstrips, and radar systems, converting reefs into fortresses. Hanoi, for its part, maintains fragile military garrisons but relies on strong historical ties of resistance against invasions, vivid reminders of the 1979 Sino-Vietnamese War. Manila mobilizes its Coast Guard and receives logistical and diplomatic support from Washington, in a chess game where the U.S. promotes freedom of navigation and conducts joint military exercises with regional allies. Kuala Lumpur and Brunei, more cautious, seek bilateral agreements, encouraging China to negotiate EEZ delimitation, but resist Beijing's pressure to not yield. The ideological factor is also decisive. For the Chinese leadership, national reunification included, in its official narrative, control over lost territories and a challenge to what they see as Western hegemony. For Southeast Asian countries, the conflict involves national sovereignty, economic rights, and post-colonial identity. The United States, while not claiming any islands, treats the South China Sea as a vital route for global trade. More than $3 trillion worth of goods pass through it annually. Competition for oil and gas, estimated at up to 11 billion barrels in reserves, and for 12% of the world's fisheries, intensifies these disputes, linking the survival of coastal populations to the decisions of ministers and generals in Beijing, Manila, and Washington. This story of maps, fire, and diplomacy repeats patterns we've seen in other wars. Think of the Falkland Islands, 1982, or Crimea, 2014. Miscalculations in the Falklands War showed how a small island can inflame national pride. In Crimea, military power turned historical grievances into fait accompli. In the South China Sea, the memory of these episodes reinforces fears that the next major crisis could begin with a simple clash between patrol boats or the unauthorized landing of a fighter jet. And now, knowing how we got here, I ask you, have we forgotten all the lessons of the past? Or are we about to repeat the same mistakes on the same stage with even more devastating consequences? When was the last time you paid for gas and felt the price rise without understanding why? The answer may lie on the edge of an artificial island, where warplanes hover over destroyed coral reefs. Today, the South China Sea is not just a point of territorial dispute. It's a thermometer of the real impact on the lives of billions of people. Each year, more than $3 trillion worth of goods cross these waters, including electronics, clothing, and food that arrives at your supermarket. A simple military maneuver can paralyze shipping routes, create delays, and increase import costs for industries in dozens of countries, from South Korea to Brazil. Did you know that up to 60% of the oil that supplies China passes through these routes? Disruptions pose an immediate risk to supply and put pressure on the price of a barrel on the global market. But the cost isn't limited to the logistics chain. Fishermen from small villages in the Philippines and Vietnam have seen their vessels seized by Chinese patrols. Entire families, who depend on fishing for their livelihood, have suffered a 30% drop in annual income. In Guiuan, a province in the Philippines, Maria Dolores, 46, weeps as she remembers the days when she brought fresh fish to the table. Today, I don't know how I'm going to pay for my children's schooling, she says, her voice sharp. How many Marias are there along thousands of kilometers of coastline? Governments resort to numbers. The South China Sea's contribution to regional GDP reaches trillions of dollars. Fishing, oil and gas extraction, tourism. But who really benefits from this power play? The defense market, for example, has taken off. In 2024, China, the US, and ASEAN countries increased their military budgets for the Navy and Coast Guard by 12%. Arms companies celebrate billion-dollar contracts for radar systems and patrol vessels. Meanwhile, economics professors warn, it's an unsustainable model. We're diverting public resources from education and healthcare to prepare warships. Social risks are also growing. Thousands of Filipino and Vietnamese workers have migrated to larger cities in search of jobs, fueling housing crises. In Malaysia's port cities, annual inflation reached 4.5%, above the central bank's target, pressured by shipping costs. Indebted families face higher electricity and gas bills. The cost of fertilizers for farmers has risen 15%, resulting in an 8% drop in rice production in some regions. Listen to the sound of the waves. It's the echo of thousands of silenced voices. In 2022, The Vietnamese Prime Minister warned in Davos, "The South China Sea is a matter of global peace." In the corridors of the UN, diplomats call for dialogue. But amid protests and economic sanctions, how many agreements will prosper before the next escalation? And at the center of this turmoil is freedom of navigation. Commercial and military vessels insist on passing through routes claimed by China, while U.S. aircraft carriers conduct innocent passage maneuvers. Behind every certificate of free passage, there are thousands of tons of tension. You, the consumer, only notice when the label goes up. There's also the humanitarian issue. Indigenous communities on remote islands, like those near the Spratlys, live with gas mining warnings and promises of infrastructure that never materialize. Young university graduates from Manila and Hanoi debate whether to migrate to Europe or North America. The Asian diaspora is expanding, bringing with it history and culture. Can we blame only governments? Or are we all complicit when we ignore the headlines and go about our daily lives? Imagine your favorite dish: crab, shrimp, or tuna, all caught in this contested sea. Each bite offers a glimpse of a conflict you may never see in the news. And the question that resonates: has the invisible cost of this dispute already passed the point of no return? If trade stagnates and supplies run low, who will foot the bill? Imagine a horizon where, instead of cargo ships, underwater drones surf those waters, silent, loaded with sensors and torpedoes. Imagine satellites pointing high-resolution cameras at every reef, every atoll built by human hands. It's no longer fiction. This is the next frontier of war. And if nothing changes, the South China Sea could become the greatest weapons technology laboratory of the 21st century. Analysts in Beijing speak of smart warfare, where autonomous systems will take center stage, eliminating direct human risk. In Brussels, maritime security experts warn that artificial intelligence will monitor every movement of foreign vessels, translate communication protocols, and even anticipate engagement orders. Satellite-guided weapons will be able to take down soft targets with surgical precision. The fog of war will dissolve into algorithms that decipher behavior patterns and ensure automatic response. For regional powers, the future is being shaped on even more sophisticated foundations. China is investing in floating ports equipped with cruise missiles and long-range radars capable of scanning ship traffic from 3,000 kilometers away. The Philippines, with U.S. support, is strengthening conventional submarines and developing coastal sensor networks to anticipate stealth invasions. Vietnam is seeking technological partnerships with India to create unmanned aerial patrols that, they say, can remain on continuous patrol for 72 hours. And the risks don't stop there. With the emergence of simultaneous cyber disputes, naval communications facilities could be targeted by military hackers. Imagine a naval blockade command being disabled by a digital attack before even firing a missile. Imagine that. It's real. Intelligence agencies indicate that state-backed groups are mapping vulnerabilities in SCADA systems at ports and oil terminals. One wrong click and fuel could stop reaching Southeast Asia. A simple digital blackout could paralyze the entire supply chain. Escalation can occur without conventional fire. All it takes is for a Russian reconnaissance vessel to operate alongside an American destroyer outside the 12 nautical mile range. Protocol requires the smaller vessel to turn around. If it doesn't comply, the opposing fleet can fire on the command tower. What's more, with the arrival of hypersonic missiles, a warning of only 30 seconds separates the target from impact. For China, controlling this space is vital. For the West, preventing Beijing from establishing a technological ring of fire around the Indo-Pacific is a matter of global security. But what about the allies? ASEAN, which once held together by diplomatic principles, is fragmented. Indonesia and Malaysia are pushing for dialogue. The Philippines is clamoring for defense guarantees. Brunei is withdrawing to advise the UN. Regional cohesion is crumbling, and the board is filled with lonely, vulnerable pieces. Have we ever seen alliances unravel so quickly? Think of the Munich Agreement, 1938 promises that evaporate in the face of territorial ambitions. And what about the Western world? Economists in London say sanctions are the only immediate response, but questions remain. How to sanction countries that control half of global trade? The European Union is debating laws to limit oil imports from disputed platforms, but fears retaliation in the agricultural and automotive sectors. In the United States, Congress is divided between those who want to increase naval presence in the region and those who advocate bilateral free trade agreements, fearing Chinese boycotts. Meanwhile, environmental NGOs are also sounding the alarm. The construction of artificial islands is destroying reefs that protect coasts and shelter endangered species. Scientists predict that, without intervention, local biodiversity could collapse by 2035, affecting fishing, tourism, and marine ecosystems that support millions of lives. Will the international community accept this devastation in the name of peace monitored from space? And you, viewer, are you ready for the next chapter? Will diplomats, generals, and business leaders decide to negotiate a technological truce before this silent arms race crosses the point of no return? Or will we send a signal across the high seas that we will not retreat in the face of the advance of autonomous warfare systems? The next war may not need soldiers, and it may already have begun. You've reached the end of this journey that began with a simple question: what's at stake in the South China Sea? Now, see the bigger picture. Warships positioned on coral reefs, imaginary lines crisscrossing maps, entire populations dependent on trade routes and forced migrations. Every military maneuver, every diplomatic notification, and every act of artificial construction has a direct impact on the price of fuel, food on the table, and even the political stability of distant countries. At this point, it's impossible to separate you, the viewer, from this reality. What seemed like a conflict confined to officers in naval uniforms affects their finances, their access to resources, and the lives of millions of people who rely on the sea for their survival. The South China Sea is at once a historical mirror and a futuristic stage. It holds cycles of European imperialism, communist ambitions, and Cold War rivalries. But it also anticipated the use of underwater drones, hypersonic missiles, and cyber warfare. This intertwining of past and future creates a geopolitical not triggered by the 9-dash line and shaped by UNCLOS, a convention that was supposed to bring peace but has instead intensified disputes. Every decision made in Beijing, Washington, or Manila reverberates throughout interconnected economies. In the academies of university students distressed by the climate crisis, and on the dinner tables of fishermen no longer able to earn a decent living. In each of the nations involved, voices are being raised in favor of different solutions. Some advocate tougher maneuvers and power struggles, while others believe in the resumption of multilateral negotiations. Dissidents within ASEAN want a united front. Other governments prefer bilateral agreements that preserve their immediate interests. Meanwhile, environmental NGOs are trying to warn of the destruction of the reefs, and human rights groups are reminding us that each artificial island built on stories of displaced communities and damaged ecosystems. None of these actors can act in isolation, as they are linked by a fabric of mutual dependence. The South China Sea is simultaneously a shared wealth and a shared threat. You, as part of this global audience, have a role to play. Consumers, voters, opinion makers, we all have the power to pressure elected leaders, defense companies, and multilateral institutions. Demanding transparency in agreements, supporting preventive diplomacy initiatives, and strengthening free navigation agreements are actions within the reach of every citizen. Ask your representatives about investing in clean energy to reduce dependence on strategic shipping routes. Support NGOs that monitor reef health and the conditions of coastal communities. Each individual gesture adds up to a wave of responsibility that can influence high-level decisions. However, history reminds us that lasting peace requires more than fine speeches. It takes political courage to cede privileges in the name of the common good, diplomatic creativity to include the voices of small states, and technological innovation to build early warning systems that prevent crises before Cold War scenarios escalate into real battles. And, above all, it takes humanity. Seeing in others, in the sailor patrolling a Chinese ship, in the Hanoi school that welcomed refugees, and in the Filipino fisherman who lost his only boat. Faces who, like you, simply want to live with dignity and security. The next war may not need soldiers, but it will need conscious citizens willing to act. This is the outcome of this documentary. An invitation to reflection and engagement. Finish this video taking with you not only information, but also the urgency to act. Discuss this topic with friends, share data with colleagues, and lobby your social networks for public debate. Because ultimately, stability in the South China Sea is a reflection of the stability we seek in our own lives. And the future, if we are to be lived in peace, depends on what we do today. Thanks for watching.